Hi, and welcome to the Keys to Therapy. Today's episode, we have Laura Lawn as our guest. Hey, Laura.
Hey, Samantha, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm so good. We just talked about coming back from my Pilates class, so I'm feeling strong.
And ready to go.
And a little sweaty, just slightly sweaty.
Yeah, but that's good. Just slightly is good in June. So,
Just a little glistle. A little
yeah, that'll add a little shine to the interview. Well, to introduce yourself to the audience in case they don't know who you are. Tell us a
Sure.
bit about you.
My name is Laura Long. I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm also a clinical supervisor in the state of South Carolina, and I am the lead badass at yourbadasstherapypractice.com, which is where I met Samantha.
Yes, I took Laura's program when I was figuring out when I was going to do a practice, planning, thinking through it. And since I took it and had everything planned, once I launched, I was good to go. No issues. So,
Mwah, chef's kiss. Yeah,
love.
so I have historically helped therapists at all stages of practice building, but really focusing in on those like first couple of years, getting them started in the right way, and that's how I came across, or I guess that's how you came across me. And now I'm kind of transitioning more into therapists who've got their practice like locked down,
Yeah.
and now they're wanting to explore really exciting new endeavors, whether it's like book writing or speaking engagements, doing their own online coaching business. So yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah. You're just growing up with us as
Yeah,
we go.
yeah. Y'all are evolving and I'm coming with you.
Yeah, I love that. And I like too that there's so many things that you just talked about that were never addressed in grad school, for me at least.
So
Even like private practice wasn't talked about, let alone all the other things you could do as a therapist ever.
yes. And I hope that our conversation leads us back to that because I would love to talk more about all of the things that you can do as a therapist because it's not just working for an agency, nor
Mhm.
is it just going into private practice. It can be both and. Like you can do so many things with our degrees. And you're right, that's not often talked about in our grad programs.
No, and I'm just even now figuring out more of what I can do, which is part of why we're here, is because here's
Yeah.
another thing I'm doing. But
Awesome.
yeah,
Yeah.
well, let's start a little bit at the beginning of, some background on what made you want to become a therapist.
Little baby Laura. Look, she's right here. She's right here.
Aw.
Ta-da! Okay, so what made me want to become a therapist? Man, I thought we were just going back to grad school. Gee, I need a couch to lay on. So I think, like many of us who want to go into the profession, we want to help others, and there's a little piece of us that maybe also wants to help ourselves. So I didn't come from the healthiest background or the healthiest family dynamic, and I was partly wanting to figure out what went wrong, or how could I have maybe done something differently, or how can I maybe raise my future children in a healthier way. So that was probably at least half of the reason I went in to become a therapist and wanted to. But another reason is that I genuinely liked helping other people. And so, like being a preteen and your 12-year-old friends are coming to you for like relationship advice and you don't know what the heck you're talking about. But it feels good to just be like a listening ear for them and to give them suggestions and come from a good place. And maybe they do it, maybe they don't. But if they do and it works, you're like, oh, that felt really good that I was able to help somebody else. I don't do blood, so I knew that like medicine was never going to be it for me.
Mhm.
And I don't particularly love the idea of teaching. So being a teacher was out. So I was like, okay, how can I help other people without getting blood on me?
Yeah.
And without having to come up with like lesson plans and stuff. So therapy was just kind of a natural avenue to go. And I've been so happy that I did that.
Yay. I love that because yeah, and it shows a lot of us there's something, whether most of us have amateur experience, I think it is, when we're younger that we're like, oh, maybe I'm like kind of good at this.
Yeah. And I loved watching Oprah, every day when
Yeah.
I come home from school, like, 11, 12 years old, my mom would have Oprah on. And
Same.
I just thought she was the shit. Am I allowed to say that? I just thought
Oh
she was
yeah.
cool. And all the guests that she had on usually had some sort of like mental health background. So that also got me interested in that. At first, I thought I wanted to be Oprah. I wanted like a TV show and have
Yeah.
guests on. And then over time, I realized I didn't really want to be Oprah. I wanted to be someone who has enough knowledge and expertise that someone like Oprah would want to bring on their show. So this is kind of me like realizing that dream. Here we are because I'm on your show.
Right. And I'm Oprah.
And you are the Oprah. So there you go.
I can dream, but I want her house. But yeah, we're starting.
At least I want her everything. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Get a
Yeah.
house down in like South Florida near you?
Yeah, she did have one in Miami. Yeah. So I think on like Star Island or something where everybody
Yeah.
else.
Or at least where you're from. I know you're not in
Yeah.
Miami, but like
Not now, but my
I don't know if your subscribers know about your background being in
yeah,
Miami.
I think I did mention it for like coming up because it's like you kind of see and hear everything. I'm like, why not? I can be helping all kinds of people because there's not very much I haven't seen or heard after growing up in Miami. So let's go. But cool. So then that's what made you want to become a therapist. Now, tell me a little bit about like what grad school was like for you because I know everybody's programs are a little bit different.
Yeah, and I do want to just back up slightly to
Yeah.
college because
Mhm.
there was a moment, and this might be true for some of your listeners too. There was a moment where I just assumed that if I wanted to be a therapist, I had to go into social work because
Mhm.
that is what I mean, most therapists out in the world are social workers, have gone
Mhm.
through that. It's just a huge industry.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, and also my brother is a social worker. So
Mm.
I just assumed that that was the path. In order to become a licensed therapist, you have to be a social worker. And a mentor of mine was already in a graduate program when I was in college, and
Mhm.
she was getting her marriage and family therapist degree. She was in a doctorate program. And I was like, wow, that's a really cool thing. I had never heard of marriage and family therapy before. And that led me to look into all the different fields that I could have gone into. And that was, it just kind of opened a door for me because I was thinking you had to be a social worker, and it turns out you can be a licensed marriage and family therapist, you can be a licensed professional counselor, and of course, you can be a social worker. You could also
Yeah.
be a clinical psychologist. So there's a few different ways that you could go about becoming a therapist. So that led me to do some more research, and
Mhm.
ultimately, I decided to go into the field of marriage and family therapy. So that's why I chose that profession. So
Yeah.
I just thought that was helpful just in case any of your listeners are at that point, maybe in college or in between college and grad school, and they're trying to decide which route to go. Just that there are routes you can take that aren't just maybe clinical psychology or social work.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because that's what ended up leading to me taking a year off between bachelor's and grad because my program was like my undergrad was so there's a huge medical school attached to it and they were so focused on research. So the only path was a PhD. And I was
Mm.
like, oh, I don't even like this statistics class I'm taking, let alone like paying to take a ton more. So I had to take a year off in order to find people in different fields to give me that experience. So that's really good info.
Yeah. So I ended up getting my marriage and family therapist degree at Auburn University, and it was a very grueling, very hard 2 years. Um, I look back on it with just like, oh my God, that was really, really hard. We had to write a thesis, do all the research you were just talking about.
Uh-huh.
I was a grad like research assistant, and so that was like nights and weekends doing that,
Oh wow.
seeing clients to get our hours in, and going to actual class and doing all those papers and everything. So
Projects.
grad school was really, really challenging. It was the hardest 2 years of my life, including like I've now had a baby and gone back to school. And I would say it still rivals those two things.
Oh wow. Yeah.
Really hard. Having like someone watch you behind that one-way mirror was pretty intense, and my professors were quite outspoken. So
Mm.
they would often just call you up. Like we had a landline phone inside the
Oh
clinical room,
wow.
like in the therapy room. So if you did something stupid, it was not uncommon for a professor to either go ahead and call you on the phone. So you're on the phone in front of your client as your supervisor is being like, what the hell was that?
Oh
Or
no.
they would just walk into the room and sort of take over the session. So that was really scary and intimidating. I'm glad now for the experience and for all of that heavy, heavy supervision that I had. But yeah, at the time it was a lot.
Yeah, it's intimidating. You're already scared as a new
Yeah.
therapist, and there's like so much fear and imposter syndrome and everything else, and then you get called out. So it's like I get the intention, but the panic as it's
Yeah,
happening.
the panic. And oftentimes you had the rest of your cohort there with you. Now, luckily, our cohort was small compared to other programs. There were only 6 of us.
Oh
But still,
wow.
you've got 5 students and a supervisor, sometimes two, behind the mirror, just staring at your session and watching everything you do and say. I mean, you blink too many times, they're going to tell you about it. If you
Mm.
adjust like how you're sitting too much, any sort of weird mannerisms that you do, they are going to just pick it apart besides the actual therapy that you're doing.
Yeah. Oh my
Mhm.
gosh. Yeah. So it's very intimidating, but I mean, a big learning experience.
Totally. Yeah. And I remember graduating and in our exit interview, I was a little bit rough with them saying, I don't feel like I'm well prepared. I don't know enough.
Yeah.
And then I went out into the real world and was like, oh my gosh, I'm actually way more prepared than I thought I was. So, they definitely prepared us. But at the time, I remember thinking, all I did was research and you picked me apart and I still don't feel prepared. But I think that's just the nature of therapy. You never actually feel completely prepared because every client is different, every situation is different, and no one is just a set of symptoms that you treat.
Hmm.
You're treating the whole person. So there's no way that you just know everything.
Oh yeah. And absolutely. And even when you hit a rhythm with a client, something happens in their life and then they come in and you're like, oh, I'm so excited to hear about this thing they're doing. And then somebody passed away or they're in a major breakup or something's happening that you're like, whoa, okay, we're pivoting even with the people you are comfortable with and know. So
Right.
there's always something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there was probably one moment or situation in my grad program that really paved the way for my next steps that I wanted to share.
Hmm.
And that was that we often had alumni come back and we would just call them alumni panels.
Okay.
Really, it was just one or two alumni coming to Auburn, maybe for a football game weekend or something. And while they're there, they would just come and talk to us about what they've been up to, what they did after graduate school, and any advice that they had for us. And I found those to be really helpful because, like you pointed out earlier, no one really told us all of the things that we could do.
Oh.
It really wasn't harped on that you could work at the VA, you could work at virtually any hospital, you could do in-home work, you could do hospice care, like all the things that are available to us. We just really weren't told that. It was more of a focus on the treatment modalities that we were learning how
Mhm.
to implement them in therapy. So one particular alumni that I remember, one of the pieces of advice that she gave that really stuck with me was when you graduate and you move on and you get another job, don't just stick with one job for the rest of your career. Really
Mhm.
try and think about what are the things that you love to do and don't be afraid to job hop. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if your goal is private practice, which this particular panel was for those of us who were just like, man, I really want to do private practice one day, and she was already in it. She
Mm.
was like, if the goal is to eventually do private practice, then your job history doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter that you went from this job and worked there for a year, and then you went to this random job over here and worked for a year. But really, she just encouraged us to do as many things as we wanted to do and
Yeah.
not be so afraid or put so much pressure on ourselves to know exactly what we want to do when we graduate and just sort of experiment almost with different jobs. And I really took that advice to heart, and it
Mhm.
kept me from putting pressure on myself to know what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Also empowered me to just like, what is it that I'm enjoying right now? Let me try that and we'll ride that train, until I don't like it anymore. And then I'll try something else instead of feeling all of this stress or pressure to work somewhere for 30 years.
Right. Yeah. Because that's just not sustainable. And a lot of times when you graduate, you don't know what your niche is going to be or who you really love working with or who you're going to be as a therapist. You're changing so much in those first few years. So it makes sense to change your job and see.
Yeah. And I think that's, our field, like mental health is just different from a lot of other fields. My husband's an
Mhm.
engineer, and granted, he's done different things over the years, but ultimately, he's doing the same thing now that he was 10 years ago. He
Yeah.
might be designing different machine parts or whatever the heck he does,
Right.
and he's worked for different companies, but the work he's doing is virtually the same.
Hmm.
Whereas in therapy, I think people who don't know what we do probably make the assumption that we do the same thing day in and day out. But
Yeah.
really, we are constantly changing and evolving. Our interests are changing and evolving. The kinds of clients that we do our best work with change and evolve. So just allowing that process to unfold over the years, I think is just great advice that I heard, instead of being like, okay, you have to know what it is you want to do and you're just going to be doing that for the rest of your life. If you like working with kids, you got to get your play therapy license or whatever and just do play therapy for 30 plus years. And
Mm.
that's not the case. You can do what like feels good to you, what you're excited about learning more about, until it's maybe no longer exciting to learn about, and then you pivot.
Oh, absolutely. I wish somebody had told me that. So I
Mhm.
feel like a lot of us in the beginning feel like there's a loyalty you're supposed to have to a certain job or a place, especially if you've gotten your license there, there's been some specific
Yeah.
training or something. I think a lot of people feel stuck or like, okay, if this almost like your first relationship, you're like, but this is all I know. And like, I need to stay with it, even when it's not the healthiest or even when it's not going the best. You're curious about like what else is out there. I think people get stuck
A
sometimes.
great example is that when you're a new grad and maybe you pass the licensing exam and now you got to get that like 2 years of supervised
Yeah.
experience. A lot of agencies, as a carrot, will offer free supervision towards your licensure, which
Mhm.
in the grand scheme of things could save you several $1,000s. But then once clinicians get fully licensed, they sometimes feel that sense of loyalty to that organization because they got free supervision
Yep.
for a year or 2 years, and now they're like, okay, well, I guess I'm just going to work here forever. Now,
Yeah.
unless you have some sort of like contractual obligation to stay there, you don't have to. You can
Mhm.
go and do something that maybe you enjoy more, or of course you can stay if you're enjoying the work. It's just that unfortunately a lot of agencies in our industry are not the healthiest.
Yeah. They kind of burn you out very early on. So it's usually good to move on if you can. And I think there's that fear of what if this is all I know how to do? But you'll never know unless you take that leap and try it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So after graduation, I got a job. I sort of like spun the globe. My husband and I were newly married. We didn't have children. We could kind of just go wherever.
Hmm.
So we're like, do, 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 do. And we both ended up landing jobs in Western North Carolina, like just outside of Asheville.
Okay.
So he was doing some engineer work there, and I got a job working for a private agency that does in school or like school based
Hmm.
therapy. And then they also have like outpatient centers too. So I was sort of doing a little bit of both. I would work in a school in this very like rural, it was an elementary and a middle school combined together. That's how rural it was. And so I had an office inside the school, and I would see clients there, kids, sometimes their families if they would come in. And then I also would sometimes work at the outpatient clinic, seeing other children and families from the county who may not be physically present at my school where I worked.
Hmm.
So I did that, and it was actually really awesome. I remember that time very fondly. The CEO, the whole leadership team of that organization was just like so great.
Oh.
They have since been, I think, forced to merge with some like huge Walmart mental health center, so it's not the same now. But when I worked there, I just remember it being really great, and just you got to find a place that has good leadership. That's really like, if the leadership is bad, then
Yeah.
it's going to have this trickle down effect to everybody else. So as long as the leadership is strong, odds are it's going to be a good organization. And sometimes in an interview, you can sort of tell.
Hmm.
I'm just going to tell you, right? Like, oh yeah, our organization kind of sucks and our leadership team is like at odds with one another.
Yeah.
But they'll give you these like subtle cues about the health of the organization. And so if they are just talking with you in your interview about the importance of productivity, and sometimes you got to work on the weekends or take your work home with you if you can't finish it, like if they're already alluding to the fact that they're expecting you to have poor work-life balance and very bad boundaries with work, then that's probably a sign that the organization is not exactly caring so much about your mental health.
Yeah.
But if they're instead focusing on like employee well-being and all the ways that they try to support the people that they work for, and if you're doing a combined interview with multiple people from the leadership team, you can really pay attention to how they interact with each other. Are they
Yeah.
sort of cutting each other off, or are they like making eye contact and smiling at each other? Some of
Right.
them more like a basic soft skills, then that sometimes can be a clue that okay, maybe this is a decent place to work. That's not surefire, but I wanted to throw that in there because I know some of the people watching might be in that place where they're starting to interview for their first job.
Oh, definitely. And to understand more of like the structure of the place too.
Mm-hmm.
Cause yeah, like you were saying, I know my first job at CUNY Mental Health, it was a substance abuse facility that a private practice merged with. And we're combining mental health. So I was going to be on the private practice side, but the substance abuse side had been like running the show. So they didn't understand us. They were more on productivity, IOP groups, like numbers, things like that. And so they didn't get us. And so hearing that, and understanding, oh, this is all new, we're still figuring this out, and understanding that had I known more things during the interview, I would have been able to pick up a little bit more on what it was going to be like when I worked.
Right. And another thing is employee retention. So
Yes.
it may be off-putting to just be like, hey, how long do your clinicians stay here before they move on to somewhere else? But you can certainly ask about the leadership team and say, okay, well,
Mhm.
how long have you been working here? Or asking about like the general leadership team and saying, how
Mhm.
long have they been employed here?
Yeah.
Because the leadership team, like I said earlier, is sort of going to have this trickle down effect. So when I was interviewing at this particular agency in Western North Carolina, I asked some of those questions and ultimately found out that the whole leadership team had been there since the company's inception,
Oh,
which was many, many years before.
mhm.
Um, I was interviewed by two different people on the leadership team. I just was really vibing with them. And I was like, I went back home to my husband and said, I guess we're moving to North Carolina. Um, so that was a great experience. We lived there for a year before my husband got a job offer in Greenville, South Carolina, which was a few hours south. And that's where we live currently. So we ended up making the really hard decision to leave that organization, but I always kept the advice of that alumni
Yeah.
back from Auburn in the back of my head. And I was like, okay, it's going to be all right. I loved working here and I can find somewhere else and it'll be okay. You
Mm.
know, maybe I'll find something different. And I remember looking specifically to do something different because of the advice that I had gotten years before. So
Mhm.
rather than focusing on doing school-based therapy, I looked at doing anything else, working at a group practice and private practice, doing like inpatient work, group home stuff, assessment. Like I just sort of looked at all of it.
Yeah.
I ended up working at a level 3 group home for adolescents. I don't know if this is the same in other states, but in South Carolina, there's different levels just
Mhm.
based on like the need of the adolescent or the child. So level 3 is like one step down from a psychiatric residential treatment facility.
Yeah.
So these were children who had a ton of trauma. There were definitely some emotional disturbances, some behavior problems as well. And in this particular group home that I worked at in Greenville when I first moved, it was sort of, there were two types of children that were placed there. One was a group that was placed by the Department of Social Services. So maybe their home was definitely unsafe. These children had a ton of trauma. And so rather than being placed in like a therapeutic foster home, they needed to be in a more secure facility. So they were in this group home. And then the second group of teens or adolescents that were placed there were placed from the Department of Juvenile Justice. So these
Mm.
were children who, because of their own behavior disorders and generally trauma as well, they
Mm.
were being placed in this treatment facility, this group home. But what happens is when you get kids placed in a facility from DSS and you combine them with kids that are placed there from DJJ, the DSS kids sort of turn into kids like DJJ kids.
Yeah.
So it was just a lot of trauma, a lot of fights, um, and the staff was really not equipped to handle all of the problems that were going on the units. You know, the staff at a lot of these places, they just don't have the sort of training. They're not trauma informed. Sometimes they barely have a high school diploma, and they're the ones who are spending the most time with the children. So I worked there for not very long because after
Mhm.
maybe like, it was less than a year. I think after 6 months or so, I started seeing that my office almost became this safe haven for the
Mm.
children on the unit who just really were just consistently being re-traumatized.
Oh
And
gosh.
whenever I would try to speak up to fix things, there was a lot of animosity between the people who were charged with, taking care of these kids and spending the most time with them and the therapeutic team, because we weren't the ones spending the most time, but we were the ones that had the most training. So there
Right.
was a lot of drama unnecessarily, and I ended up having to leave there for my own mental health
Mm.
after about 9 months. I think I lasted there.
I mean, that's a pretty good run in a place like that. Cause you're right I've noticed that in places I've been to where some of like the techs or things like that don't have the training. So, or the ethical codes to stand by or certain things like that. And there's so much boundary crossing. There's alignments, there's like things that are happening that just aren't really healthy. So I think you made a good point. It's sometimes, part of learning is what doesn't fit for you and to get out of there and save yourself. And that's okay.
Yeah. And I did what I could. So I had a supervisor at the time towards my licensure, and that supervisor just so happened to be, I think her title was county director
Oh,
of
wow.
that county where the group home was located.
Mhm.
She was the county director of the Department of Social Services. So
Mm.
my direct supervisor for my licensure was over the caseworkers who were placing a lot of children at this exact facility. So when I would staff cases with her, there would be times where I would come to her and say, this happened on the unit, and I had to actually file a report with your organization
Wow.
because of what my organization did to a child. And so there were times where she would actually be able to like make some change because there was like some weird hierarchy where essentially she's in charge of some of the happenings at the group home, even though she didn't work directly there. She worked for the organization or the agency that was placing children there. So that kind of worked in my benefit a little bit because
Wow.
when things happened that were really not okay, I was able to sort of advocate for these children by talking to my direct supervisor. So that worked out. But yeah, ultimately, like you said, I had to save myself too. And so I left after 9 months. And honestly, at that point, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to do therapy anymore because
Mhm.
I feel like I just had my own vicarious trauma from working at a place like that. So
Yeah.
I considered just leaving the field altogether. And I'm saying that because those of you who are maybe watching this in a situation like the one I had left, you might be feeling that way right now too, saying to yourself,
Um,
gosh, all of this work that I did to go to grad school and to work towards licensure, and now I'm not even sure if I want to stay here or not. It
mhm.
very well could just be that you need a break from the level of either dysfunction or trauma that you're seeing day in and day out. So I would just encourage you to stay in the field, but maybe find a job that's less stressful, even if it's a little bit more menial or something that you don't feel like you could do long term. Because remember, you can change jobs at any point. You're not stuck
Exactly.
anymore.
Yeah, but that's such a good point because I've had friends, especially since COVID, that mental health was one of the industries that boomed during that time. Like we were the busiest we've ever been, and a lot of people were going through their own stuff, and we're just like, I can't maintain this level of care for people and care for myself at the same time. And I had friends who were like, I'd rather just go deliver groceries or just like go work at a bookstore or change completely. And it's like, but is it the job or is it your current setting?
Exactly. Yeah.
So
And
yeah.
usually it's the latter.
Yep.
Well, let's change the setting or let's make some changes to the setting if you're able to.
Hmm.
Because what I found, at least in my situation, is that when I changed from that group home to something that was completely different, but still within the mental health industry,
Hmm.
I felt like I got my energy back. So,
Yeah.
that would have sucked if I had left and just did something completely different just because of a bad setting for 9 months, after all
Right.
those years of hard work.
Absolutely. That would have sucked for me because then you never would have ended up getting to the place
I
that you
know.
were
Yeah, there
at.
you go.
And then
I
like
never would have become a business coach for therapists.
yeah, and all the other people you've helped along the way. So like that would have been like this terrible domino effect for all of us. But and then back to our clients in the field and everything else. So thank you for staying.
Oh, you're welcome. So my next job after that was working at a really cool, innovative assessment center,
Hmm.
and it was this like brand new idea that had come out of the West Coast. I think there was a place in Washington State doing something like this. And so in Greenville, South Carolina, of all places, they decided to do something similar where when a child was removed from their home by the Department of Social Services, rather than just like throwing them in a foster home and giving the parents or caregivers some like just real generic
Hmm.
parenting classes or whatever it is that they needed to do, they created this, or this assessment center was created. It was sort of a partnership between a few different organizations, so that when a child was removed from the home, that child and the family received some pretty comprehensive and thorough assessments to determine what would be the best course action for reunification of the family.
Oh
So
wow.
the children who were usually like infants, toddlers, because they're the ones that are getting seen the most by like medical professionals. And so an infant or a 1 or 2 year old would be going to like their well visit, and that's when the doctor would see something is off and make a report.
Mm.
So these children would ultimately get all kinds of like medical testing that they may not have gotten otherwise. So there were like forensic pediatricians that worked through this organization, this assessment center, and they would do these like thorough physical exams of the children. They would get developmental screenings just to make sure that they were where they needed to be developmentally, and most of the time they weren't. So then they were able to get intervention early. And then my job, because the children were usually a lot younger, so I wasn't able to really assess their mental health at, 6 months old or something.
Mhm.
But I would go to where the parents or the caregivers were. And sometimes that meant I had to go visit them in jail.
Oh, wow.
I would go to their homes. They would come to the assessment center directly, and we would give them this or I would administer essentially a battery of screening tests and various assessments. Some were more like structured interview type assessments. There was just having a conversation, but they also had to fill out these various screeners so that I could better determine and make recommendations to DSS about what needed to happen for reunification for the families. So it was really cool because I felt like I was making a difference and doing something that was just really innovative in our field,
Yeah.
rather than just slapping like, hey, take some parenting classes. I
Mhm.
felt like the whole family system was getting help and we were addressing them at every angle.
Oh,
I
yeah.
got to help put that program together. I was the first hire for it.
Oh, wow.
And so I really took a lot of ownership over it. And my goal or plan anyway was to stay there long term. I was like, I've
Mhm.
made it. This is great. I'm not doing therapy, which is a little sad, but I'm getting to do these assessments and that's still cool too.
Mhm.
And I have a say so in how the program is developed. So obviously the story doesn't end there because my plan was just to stay there and just like ride it out.
Yeah.
I was having a really great time. Um, Super long story short, we made a really poor choice in a hire that we made. And I feel horrible because I helped get this person hired, but we as a department hired the person who ultimately became the director of this department. And we had really high hopes. We were totally bamboozled by this
Oh,
person.
gosh.
Um, who, like I said earlier, leadership trickles down. So if you have
Mhm.
strong leadership, that's going to trickle down in a positive way. If you have really poor leadership, that's just going to poison the entire organization. And unfortunately, that's what happened. So the person that we had hired contributed to that. I wouldn't say that it was all one person, but ultimately there were a lot of like holes in the boat, if you will. And
Mhm.
I think that particular person shed a lot of light on those holes and then was kind of opportunistic about it. And it was really toxic and bad.
Mm.
So I had to leave and I didn't want to. But again,
Mhm.
for my own mental health, I was like, this sucks. And I really loved, like, I created this thing or I helped
Right.
to create this thing that's helping families. And now I have to get out of Dodge and I've got to get out quick.
Mhm.
So I left, and shortly thereafter, I'd say within the next year, pretty much the entire department left as well.
Oh, wow.
And I believe they're still running in some capacity, just with mostly a new team.
Mm.
Um, but what that did, and I feel looking back that the universe was like, hey, if you want to do private practice one day, we have to make this situation so bad for you,
Yeah, you're gonna leave it.
because the only way you're going to leave is if this is just like the absolute worst, like you're having
Mhm.
panic attacks on your way to work kind of level of
Oh.
toxic. So, and that was true. So that was the only way the universe was going to get me to go, is if
Mhm.
it was that bad. And it was. Um, and that's what led me to venture into private practice, in my mind, very prematurely.
Mhm.
I did not feel ready, but I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave and I'm just going to do my own thing. And I'm finally going to get to do therapy again. And I'm going to do it on my own terms.
That's amazing. That's so brave too.
It didn't feel so brave at the time. I probably felt like I was going to pee my pants on a regular basis. But when you don't feel like you have another option,
Mhm.
it doesn't feel as like brave. You're just like, okay, this is it, because I'm leaving this agency, and all the other ones in my area felt like, based on my friends who were therapists there, seemed like I was just trading one horrible work environment for another. So
Mhm.
that's why I ultimately made the decision to just go into private practice. And I was very privileged to have the support of my husband, both emotionally and financially, because so many people that, right? So if I was just
Mhm.
like single or single parent, I probably wouldn't have been able to make that choice. And instead, I would have had to go somewhere where I could have a more consistent paycheck and maybe build my private practice on the side. But in this
Right.
situation, I really was lucky to be able to leave that job and not really have a safety net, so to speak.
Yeah, and sometimes that's when people can do their best work. I mean, you're thrown into the fire and it's like, okay, I need this to survive, so I'm gonna make it work.
Yeah, there was no, yeah, let's try this for a little while. And if it doesn't work out, I'll, work at Starbucks or whatever.
Mhm.
In my mind, this was going to work one way or another. And I thought to myself, I got really great training, finally
Mhm.
appreciating that Auburn degree. I had a lot of great experience. I felt confident in my clinical skills. So I was like, there have got to be people out there in the world who are less smart than me who are
Mhm.
doing this. This can't be this thing I'll ever do, right? Like
Mhm.
starting a private practice, starting a business, it's hard, it's grueling, but in my mind, and maybe this was just me being naive, I had thought to myself, there's no way this is going to be harder than the 2 years I spent at Auburn.
Mhm. True. Yeah.
It's
And like
just
you
like doing research. Like okay, do I need a business license? Cool. How do I do that? Right? A lot
yep.
of Googling, took a lot of people out to lunch and asked questions, and just figured it out as I went, because back then there weren't business coaches, there weren't really programs that you
Mhm.
could buy to learn this stuff, which is funny
Right.
to think, because now there are so many places you can go to learn, so many free resources like what you're doing.
Mhm.
And of course, really great, amazing paid programs that you can purchase to learn the ropes. So you don't have to do it just like bootstrapping it as you go.
Yeah.
Back in 2013, that's what I did.
Mhm. And we're all learning from it, which is great.
Learning from my mistakes and my successes.
Yeah, but I feel like people are open to helping you, and it sounds like you were willing to ask for the help, which is another big thing. So I feel like we're not really taught that. I feel like at least in my program, a lot of grad school is very much like you need to figure it out, you need to be the expert, you need to know how things are going to go, you need to be in charge, like all of these things that it just made it feel like if you didn't know what you were doing something wrong. So the community is huge though.
A lot of grad schools inadvertently set us up to like fail
Mhm.
emotionally.
Yes.
They kind of keep us in these fish bowls, and they create these environments where we feel know how to do stuff, and then we don't ask for help, and then
Mhm.
we isolate. Then we're not building community, we feel lonely, burned out, depressed. And I don't want to just like single-handedly blame grad schools, because one of the complaints that they had in my exit interview, when I said, these are the things that I wish were different,
Mhm.
one of the things that came back at me is that, well, we only have 2 years. There's only so much in 2 years that we can do to set you all up for success in the real world. And that
Mhm.
is a valid point,
Mhm.
that most of our grad programs are only 2 years, some are
Yeah.
3. Um, is the answer a longer grad program? I don't know, possibly, but I guess that's why they think that the 2 years of supervised experience for
Mhm.
most of us, like that's where we're going to get some of that real world experience. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm not a policymaker.
Yeah, don't wanna be.
No, I will say that, grad school is not perfect. They're like our parents, right? Like they made mistakes too. And no
Absolutely.
grad school is going to give you absolutely everything that you need to thrive in the real world. So some of that you just got to find on your own.
Yeah, absolutely, and it sounds like that's something that you're willing to do, is build a community for yourself or seek out the people who are doing some of the things that you wanted to do, and, for the price of lunch or whatever else, like,
Yeah,
figuring out how to learn the things that weren't formally taught.
exactly. Um,
Awesome.
so I was lucky enough to connect with some therapists in my area who They were in private practice, sort of together, but it wasn't a group practice where they hired employees. They
Mhm.
were just each doing their own thing, and they had an extra office, and they were willing to let me rent that office from them. So that's where I got started. And so I worked there and kind of got my bearings and learned some of the more like basic how to's of setting up a private practice. And they were so helpful. I mean, they were instrumental in getting me set up and sort of teaching me the ropes, if you will.
Mhm.
And I stayed with them for several years before I ended up going off and kind of getting my own space. I didn't buy a building, but I went in with another therapist. And so we created a partnership and we got this really, really nice building. This was 2018, and we've been there ever since.
Aw.
So that's sort of been like my private practice journey, a little anticlimactic, not too eventful, but I like it that way.
Yes. Yeah, and there's still like, it's a bumpy road, and I think it is for a lot of people, but you
Yeah.
still learn a lot of lessons along the way. And then for you, it sounds like a lot of your work prior to private practice was with kids. And so that shifted as you had your own practice.
Absolutely. Yes. Because my experience was working with children and families. My grad program was really heavy on like family dynamics and
Mhm.
children, and I that wasn't my preferred population, but it was I knew how to do it, right? That
Yeah.
was where my training really came from. In the back of my mind, though, I always wanted to work with couples.
Mm.
That was something that was just really fascinating for me. My grad program did do a little bit of emotionally focused therapy training for us, so I felt competent being able to like sit across from a couple, um, but I didn't have a ton of experience. So when I transitioned into private practice for myself,
Mhm.
um, with that group, that the two clinicians that were kind of separate, but we were all doing kind of our own thing in the same place.
Yeah.
That's when I started to transition into working more with individual adults, couples, and I had a few families sprinkled in there.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so I did some just like basic additional trainings along the way as I was able to afford to. I didn't get any like special certifications, but pretty much every continuing education that I had to do was focused on couples.
Oh,
And so
nice.
that's what I did all the way up until I'd say close to 2018 when I moved to my own space,
Mhm.
just me and that other clinician. And that's when I changed my niche again and was starting to get a little bit burned out of working with couples. So I focused more on individual adults. And now it's like I've morphed again, but my private practice is primarily working with entrepreneurs, top performers, people who are maybe at the top of their game,
Yeah.
business perspective, but personally they're really struggling, whether it's with relationships or stress management, burnout, insomnia, all the after effects of performing so well here. Now
Right.
everything else is sort of deteriorating. But yeah, so that's my favorite place to go and to work with people on.
That's so cool though, because again, it shows that you're not stuck in any space. Like, and exactly what the advice that you were given in grad school of try different jobs, do different things, and then figure out where it is that you want to end up. That's exactly what you've been doing. And I think that that's great advice because it shows that it's not, I don't know, any stereotypical, like it's flighty or non-committal or whatever. It's just you gaining as much experience as possible, like to figure out what you do and don't want to do. Like I call it the Goldilocks method, kind of where you're like, "Ooh, that's too hot. That's
Yeah.
too cold," but you don't know what's just right until you've tried both. So
Yes.
that's what
So
you've
just
been.
give yourself permission to evolve.
Hmm.
Working with entrepreneurs and people who work really, really stressful jobs, that's not something that I had an interest in 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But once I started getting experience, maybe more personally in that, once I started working with couples where one or both of them were struggling with that, that's when I really gained a newfound interest in it and started reading more books and listening to podcasts and getting more continuing education on working with those sorts of issues. So
Hmm.
like, there is no end. You're not like, I'll never feel like I've arrived. Right.
Hmm.
It's just I'm constantly evolving and just allowing myself to do whatever it is that I'm feeling compelled to do, that I feel competent doing. And if I don't feel competent, get some more training in that and give myself permission to change along the way as I need to.
Yeah, and like you've said, I mean, there's not a final destination necessarily. It always shifts and moves and evolves depending on where you're at with your life or what you're getting burned out with or trends that you're seeing that you specialize even further as time
Mhm.
goes on, like you have. So,
Exactly.
yeah, nothing has to be at a standstill. You don't have to be the child therapist or whatever label that you think you do or other people are putting on you.
And you can be until it doesn't serve you anymore, right?
Mhm.
And generally speaking, when we change our focus clinically, there's a story behind it. It makes a lot of sense. So, for example, like the child
Yeah.
therapist, maybe you want to work with children right now, and a couple of years from now, you find yourself really gravitating towards teens.
Hmm.
There's a story behind that, and you can make it make sense. You can position yourself to say to referral sources, to your community, why you, well, you're the play therapist. Like, why are you transitioning? Well, the children that I loved working with are now teens, and I'm realizing that that's a new opportunity for me to get into.
Mm.
Or I've known a lot of therapists who start off working with children, and then they almost make this what seems like a flip to working with parents. And they're
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh, people aren't going to understand that I used to work with kids and now I want to work with parents. But it actually makes a whole lot of sense because you're talking to parents and you're helping parents along
Mhm.
the way when you're working with children. So it can make sense if
Yeah.
you're able to weave that story for people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's just the other side of the coin. So, yeah, I think for me, I notice every year it ages up as my youngest clients age up. And now I'm like, oh, my youngest are going to college, and most of what I see is college students. Maybe I'm not going to see teens anymore. I don't know. I'm
Maybe
loving this
an
time.
adult.
Yeah, it's kind of shifting, but
And as they graduate college and maybe start getting like married or partnered or having children or whatever the case is, at that point in the future, your niche might change along with them, and that's okay too.
yeah, you just kind of grow with them like you have with all the therapists you've coached. Well,
Yeah.
before we go, I would love to know, I know you shared a lot of advice for therapists that things that they should know earlier in their careers or things that they should know as they're kind of moving through their professional lives. So is there any other pieces of advice that you could think of that maybe you wish you knew earlier in your career or you'd like to pass along?
Maybe to think of any place that you work the way that you would think about a relationship. So, if a place you're working supports you, if they care about your mental health and well being, then stay in that place of employment, right? Stay in that relationship. But once a place of employment is starting to treat you just like a number, like you don't matter, all they care
Mhm.
about is productivity, you filling out forms, and they really are not investing in you as a whole person, it's the equivalent of being in a relationship with someone who no longer cares about those things either. You wouldn't stay in a relationship, so don't stay in a place of employment that's going to treat you that way. Find one that does respect and honor you as a person, one where you all are working more collaboratively instead of just you're a pawn and you're just there to like pump out client after client.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. And I like that analogy because I think, like you said earlier, with the loyalty and different things that I think people feel towards the jobs they're in, feel guilty about switching or they worry too much about the clients. That's like parents worrying about the kids if they need a divorce or, stuff like that. And it's like, but if the system's not healthy, no one in it is going to be healthy.
Exactly. So if you're working in a broken system and you feel horrible for your clients who you might leave behind, there's no way you're doing your best work if you're being held captive by a toxic soul sucking agency.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So
So.
that's what I would leave your listeners with.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, like you said, a lot of the early career like experiences or places that hire a lot of agencies, community mental health, stuff like that, they tend to veer more towards that churn them out. Like, let's look at the numbers and get them in and stuff like that. So it's good for people to know that one, that's not how everything is, but also they're not stuck in that.
Nope, they are definitely not.
Yeah.
Thinking of the first job that I had right out of grad school, and it was such an amazing place to work. So you're
Mhm.
not stuck. You don't have to work for the soul sucking agency. Find a different one, find a better one.
Absolutely. Use all your options and resources and you get
Mhm.
to grow along the way, but you don't have to make the growing painful.
No, you
Not like
don't.
extra
So
points.
many places that you can go.
Mhm. Oh, well, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. I appreciate it.
Girl, I love what you're doing.
Oh, I appreciate all the support. Yeah, and I think again, it's like how you were saying you met with people who pass along information to you as you were starting out in a new part of your career. I'm hoping that that's what we're able to do today too.
Exactly. Love it, girl. Well, thanks for having me. And I hope that your listeners got a lot out of our time together.
I hope so too. And I'll link your stuff below so they can follow you and see where you're at. Keep up with
Awesome.
all the cool stuff, retreats, and all the things you're doing. So,
Join the party.
yes.
The water's warm.
Well, I'll link all that below. If you guys want to follow what we're doing here, go ahead and subscribe. I also have my information below for joining my email list and my new Facebook group. So hope to see you guys there. Thank you. Bye,
Thanks,
Laura.
Mira.